This meeting is being recorded.
Hey there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay with the Complicated Kids podcast. And today I am delighted to welcome back to the show, Emily Griffin. Emily, thank you for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me.
I got to read my notes. Okay, Emily, you work with perinatal, parenting, and relationship support. And
yes,
right before we hit record, we were talking about why, first of all, we like each other anyway, but we were talking about why it's a very good fit for you to come on this Complicated Kids podcast, because one of your groups is called, fill in the blank.
Complicated Parenting. Right.
So
yes,
we are coming from this very complicated place that hopefully we will make it a little less complicated for people through our discussion. But so when you are thinking about perinatal, parenting, and relationship support for families, what are, just start talking about some of the things that come up as we're doing this.
Sure. Yeah. So I often have two general points of entry where people find me. Either they are being very proactive and realize that there are patterns that happened in their family growing up that that they don't want to continue. And they want to be really intentional with how they apply what they've been trying to learn about mental health. And people like to make that old joke of well, my kid's gonna be in therapy anyway, but I don't want them to have to go complain to their therapist about this one day, right?
I always tell my kids, by the way, I always say, I am making different mistakes than my parents made. So you will tell your therapist different things than I told mine. And it's all good. It's all fine.
Yeah. I mean, so I love wrapping around families as early as possible. And so, I have my my couples communication class that I do that's all about, really strengthening and fine-tuning the tools that you have in this, what do you have in your relationship that you want to remain strong, and how can we, moving through, whatever birth and pregnancy complications that kind of leave some residue in the nervous system, and make them kind of rattled when they're okay, now we're bringing the baby home and no one's here to wrap around us. Especially in DC, right, where we are, there's so many transplants. And so, people are having to build their support system in a new way while just trying to take care of the basic needs of themselves and their baby, And
then lots of things come up. We could just pause here for a second, right? Because when you're a childless couple, there are things that we do that keep ourselves sort of grounded and healthy and sane and all of those things. And many of those things are brought about by having some extra time.
Yes.
And when you have a child, particularly if you have a complicated child with any kind of medical or developmental needs, let's just say though, for the purposes of this conversation, having a child is complicated anyway. Bringing a baby home. I remember my son's 20. When I brought him home, I was like, you're going to let me leave the hospital with this? What?
Yes.
I am in no way prepared for this.
And that is a feeling that so many parents have, no matter how many accolades they've earned at work. And, but I think sometimes we convince ourselves that, oh, well, I'm an achiever and I know how to have this sense of control in my life. So give me the right books, give me the right expert. I got this, and here's this baby. We're going to knock this out of the park. And inevitably, the baby is right. Inevitably, the baby's excuse me. No, I have my own self here that I'm going to make space for, and just how much that fourth trimester and fifth trimester, they're babies to an extent through age 3. And none of us are really prepared for that conversation. Yeah. right? And
And
so
now we're
like,
not living with our mothers and our
no.
aunts and our grandmothers who would tell us that in due time. Because
Yes.
if they told you that before, you'd be like, no, I got this handled. It's all good.
Yeah.
Right?
But they might, right? But like
Mm.
sometimes the messaging, they, you know, our extended family members, as well-intentioned as they are, they're looking back with rose-colored glasses. Maybe they did cry it out and like, oh, you were such a good baby, you know, and then like the parent is like, why is my baby's crying affecting me so much, you know? And so like really helping them with that attachment piece and understanding like where there's so much room for healing still to like reach back, you know, for their inner child. Like this is, you know, you're in such a vulnerable space when you are trying to adjust to life with this baby.
Yeah.
You know, and then like if another one's coming along and that baby's different, and gender, oh my goodness, you know, if you have a complicated relationship with your father or your brother growing up, and now you have this baby boy, and like, why am I boys can be very emotionally neglected, you know, because of how we are conditioned to treat boys.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It is something, it's a thing. It is really a thing.
And there's a funny thing that happens, I find, with parenting in particular, which is like we assume, and not out of the blue, that like because people have been parents for millennia, that like we will just naturally figure it out. And that's a really interesting way to be. And there's two things happening, I think, for the people who come to us. One is they have assumed in the past that there is a natural way to do this. And though they are thinking about how they would like to do it. And those two things are not lining up in the slightest.
Yes.
Because there isn't a problem if you're just going about your business and you're not questioning any of your decisions. In fact, that's a beautiful space to be. Now, it can have results that you don't want.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. I have parents who like, you know, this has come up multiple times over the 10 years that I've had my private practice now. And you know, also when I was working in a school for 9 years before that. I mean, this idea that like, oh man, it must be nice to be, you know, the person in the dynamic who has their head in the sand, you know, because it's like, well, it's, you know, self-awareness and having your eyes open to these relational dynamics and where there can be real inroads is a double-edged sword, because then it's like you can't unsee it. You have to attend to it.
Right.
You know, and you really need a safe space to be able to unpack those layers that come up, and our kids can, like, either when they're babies or when they're toddlers or a little bit older, maybe around the age when we went through something very difficult ourselves, they can hold up this mirror to us and like, excuse me, you're not quite here with me in the room. Can you work on that, please? So you can properly co-regulate with me. Like, this is still something I need. And maybe you can reach in and do some work so you can build up that muscle within yourself and be more emotionally available for everybody.
It's so fascinating. Okay, let's take a small example. Then I want to hear like kind of how the dynamic happens between spouse or co-parents. Because one of the things that came up in a recent session with one of my clients is she discovered that she's got very sensitive hearing, like actually has an audiological hypersensitivity. So when her child is screaming, she becomes dysregulated. And she never, so the good news is she didn't know that before. And now she knows that, so she can attend to herself in those moments. And then, of course, you have to unpack like, well, I feel terrible when I'm dysregulated because my baby's screaming, because the thing I'm supposed to do is be able to calm down my child, right? So then you have to unpack all of that. But I you talk here. Tell me like,
well, okay. Well, where you're taking me ultimately is that, I can totally relate to that. And I didn't really understand what this was about and the ability to heal complex childhood trauma
Mm.
until like I was at my lowest point when I had my third baby, and like people don't, and I'm the third, by the way, in my family order.
Lest
And
we think there are any coincidences in life, there are not.
it's very interesting though. Like, I mean, that one thing that I came to understand about myself. Okay, so that was my third, and then I went on to have a fourth and a fifth. And one thing I learned about myself is that when my kids get to about the age of 9,
Mm-hmm.
I have this instinct to like speed up their growing up process. Because when I was 9, that's when my parents got divorced. And that mattered so much that I made that connection. I didn't really make the connection until my second was about 9.
Okay.
But my third and my fourth, who have hit the 9-year-old mark, have benefited from me having that awareness, so that I can really kind of, shift my lens through which I am viewing when they are having kind of a growth moment, and like, and so, okay, Emily, stay present. You're noticing this urge that comes up that like can kind of come out like this like tyrant, like my dad would be when he was really worried about us being late in the morning. Like I can kind of, when I'm overwhelmed, I can get a little much, and it's too much for them. But making room for really understanding what I went through helps me then to meaningfully understand their perspective, and like how important it is to have a loving way to wake your kids up in the morning. Like some of us were woken up like drill sergeant, style, and that is the first transition of the day. And that will really set your nervous system up for not good things. So let's make some shifts, even just in a very tangible way. How can we make room for that?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's how those conversations go with people who are reaching out. Sometimes it's a starting point of like, my kid has this behavior and I'm really worried, and do I need to do an evaluation? Da, 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 da. But then like we can kind of unpack it and look at like, oh, okay, well, here's some ways that we haven't been attending to your own boundaries. And so overwhelm then leads to anxiety that's spilling over, and then your kid is feeling like they are less than because they can't keep up with your standards. And, so unpacking that stuff is huge. And not that the evaluation isn't necessary at some point, right?
That's right.
Like, I mean, shoot,
but let's meet in the middle. It is such a trip when you start realizing that when I started realizing that my thinking about a certain situation was causing a feeling that was leading me to take some actions. And then I was creating the bad result, not anybody else outside of me. I was doing it to myself.
Yes.
I was like,
yes.
oh my God, I gotta change this. And then guess what? And this is what we teach at Raising Market Kids too. We teach it in a slightly different way, in as much as we start talking about what are the behaviors that you're observing, and what are the things that are happening right before those behaviors.
Yes.
And that is where your greatest power is, right? In the antecedent. And probably the antecedent most needs to be that I stay calm. And then, of course, what you're talking about is if you have complex trauma or any kind of trauma, you actually can't stay calm. So
Yeah. And I mean, because also we're kind of at this place where we're just now accepting the spectrum of what is complex childhood trauma. You know what I mean?
Explain more about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there was kind of this opening up to the understanding of like, okay, child abuse is bad, right? And like, we kind of know that when we see it, right? We know physical abuse, we know sexual abuse. Emotional abuse and neglect can come from a parent who knows how to perform support, but not really see what does their child need and make room for that.
Oh, wow.
Okay. A lot of us were raised with this messaging that like you just do what you're told, your feelings don't really matter in the context of what this is, what dinner routine is, this is what time, blah blah blah, you know. And there's and a lot of parents didn't understand how their presence throughout their child's life, you know, until they launch really does matter, you know. A lot of the parents from our parents' generation, you know, just kind of like, okay, well, they can make their way home from school, so I can stay at work until dinner time and they'll be fine, they can watch TV, blah blah blah, and we got left alone, you know. A lot.
Which
That's what
has
a lot
its
of
benefits.
yes,
Also,
yes,
right? Like there's,
it does.
as you're talking, I'm like, there are so many pluses to some of what you're saying.
Yes.
And the minuses that come up when we sort of do the opposite is like, we're in this constant state of like, what does my child need now? What does my child need now? I'm never giving enough, right? So there's like this,
Right.
it is this balance of, you know, of just enoughness, where everybody feels like just enough, because it's not a never ending to-do list that we're trying to give to kids. Like that is not life. That's not how it is.
No. And they do need to, you know, have breathing room to figure out some things on their own. And, you know, and like, you don't want to be hovering. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, but I think when we have come from parents who were overbearing, let's say, just as a descriptor, right? Then we may overcorrect that thing with our kid, you know, and then we're not necessarily adjusting, you know, kind of course correcting with the needs that are coming out from that child. It's just, you know, it's like, it's more about like, oh, well, this is the right thing. And so you get two parents who, you know, if you have someone who, you know, had one type of experience growing up, and then this one had a different, and then they come together and they don't realize how hard that's going to be until they're in it. You can't, you know, it's like, it's hard for people to have the crystal ball to say, okay, yes, this is my person for life, and this is who I want to have kids with, and I know exactly how they're going to be when we have kids. No, there's no way to really know that, because we have these wounds that come up. And generally speaking, you know, it can be a good sign that like it's worth, if you feel like you're able to make room for plugging in with, you know, with somebody to like try to explore, like, what are my wounds? How can I really, you know, kind of support my younger self who is feeling activated with this behavior, or when this need arises? You know, sometimes it's around bedtime, sometimes it's around food, you know, there are things that, or driving in the car, like there are just these things that can be super activating for us. I don't like the word trigger, so I like to say activating.
I like activating too. I will tell you a story. When my parents, when I was growing up, we would sit in the back seat. We were 3 kids across the back. Somebody was always in the middle, like egging on the other one. But when we would drive on the highway, my father would always drive, and my mother would do this.
Oh yes, my mom did that too, and that was so stressful.
It's so stressful. But guess what I did when I was a passenger, as the wife and the mother in the car with the husband driving? And it fortunately did not take me very long to be like, and literally it only, I'm pretty sure it didn't happen until there were kids in the equation. Like, I think that his driving was just, by the way, his driving is just fine, but his driving was just fine until there was a baby in the back. Now, all of a sudden I'm having a hissy fit. Why? I'm just reenacting behavior. And
Yeah.
not even doing it on purpose. Like, again, there's nothing wrong with the driving.
Right.
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 And so untangling that. And then, of course, he's mad because he thinks that I don't think that he's a good driver. So
Yeah.
then, like, picking that one apart and being like, okay, well, how do we want to do this? We have some options here, right? Like, I could stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could drive. And then I would be a lot less likely to inhale all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? Some of the time he drives and some of the time I drive, and I'm very aware.
Mm-hmm.
But it is that kind of like, that is kind of a detail level of processing. Yeah.
Yes, we get down to the granular level, and that I've never seen a time that wasn't rewarding.
Mm-hmm. Say more about that. What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, just like when a parent is ready
Mm-hmm.
to show up, not only for their kids, not only for their spouse and like the family that they want, right? And making themselves available for that family, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, but it's for them. It's for the individual too. Like, you deserve this. You have worked so hard to have this family happen, and you don't want to spend your string together your days that like are sprinkled with like what these are going to be the memories, like.
That's so interesting too, right? Because we're at war often with like this idealized version of this family life that we're supposed to have. This is something we also talk a lot about in Raising Orchids, because orchid kids by definition are not following kind of this typical trajectory, right? They're doing something else.
Yeah.
And so we're sort of grieving that, and it's the reality of the daily experience is so different from what we see in our minds on the television, on Instagram, like the right, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And if we continuously put ourselves up in opposition to that, now we are, again, then this is where we are creating our own reality, right? We're creating that lack and that discontent instead of being in the life that we're in and then finding out kind of what's working for us and what's not.
Yeah. And, that is kind of the essence of why I called my practice Happy Parents, Happy Babies, because I lived that understanding. Like I had to open up to that. I had to grieve the fact that, like, for me and this baby at this point, breastfeeding is not in the cards, and I don't want to pump, and I'm putting it down so that I can make room for connecting with this little person. Like that was the biggest shift for me and him and my older kids and me and my husband and me and my younger kids. Like, that facilitated the rest of it. And I am still actively healing. There's still things that come up for me, rooted in what my parents didn't quite get right, and they did the best they could, but blah, blah, blah. Right. Yeah. But I still, like, I'm able to move through those ebbs and flows and be aware of my sensitivity and use that, harness it like a superpower, not all the time, not perfectly. Right. But it's like, I feel empowered within the things that are in my control. And then trusting in my ability to use those has really beautiful ripple effects.
Yes, that's right.
And so that is kind of generally what happens with everybody I work with. Like, they have their own story and unfolding, and it's just like, why do I get to do this job? It really just feels like a gift to me every day that I get to, and so I'm just kind of holding space with them and helping them to, like, let in what beauty is already happening and seeing where they can kind of adjust those lenses for
Yes.
meeting their people where they need to be met.
Yeah.
And that is very freeing for the parent I'm working with too.
Yeah.
You know?
What the phrase that's coming into my mind is, it doesn't have to suck.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really doesn't.
Yeah. So that, I mean, right. And that's the happy parents, happy babies is kind of tongue in cheek, because it's like, it's not all glitter and rainbows, it's really not. But the gratitude, the slowing down, and really, being able to I had to learn how to have fun. I was just on this motor, that like, oh, I have to get through this. And there's always something to do. And, I'm the fun police, right? That's not how I want my kids to remember me.
Yeah.
That's not what I want to continue.
Yeah.
So how am I going to break this? So the meaningful things that need to be broken, to then, okay, we can break all this down and be selective of what do we want to keep from the foundation, to then be responsive to our kids, to our partners, to ourselves. Sometimes that then opens up some grief with, our family of origin. Sometimes we wind up needing to talk a lot more about a particular family member. And, sometimes we do family sessions because hey, I'm trying to figure out, how is my kid even going to have a relationship with grandma when she is just doing this thing and not having this awareness, so that's
a whole other topic too, which is this, particularly for women, but also for men, I'm sure, where you are simultaneously the parent and the child.
Yes.
Oh my God.
And this is where the boundaries conversation comes in. And that's why I really try to, I know I'm speaking very pointed, but I am so passionate about it because I've seen how there's so much torture that, we don't have to tolerate.
Yeah.
But it also
are doing some of that ourselves, right? Where we're we have to please everybody.
Yeah.
And by the way, when we do that, we please nobody, and least of all ourselves. But somehow
therefore back to boundaries,
right? Back to boundaries. But somehow that feels like the problem brain is trying to solve is how can everybody else be happy here? And then let's have an orchid kid who has some complex needs, who physiologically really can't tolerate a hug from grandma.
Yes.
Or even really to look at grandma. And now we're oh gosh, what do we do here? Right. And so it is these situations come up all the time. And unless I hear you talking about it too. And I love that you and I could go on all day, but you, at some point you get to break that cycle because it doesn't have to suck.
Yes. Yes. And you want your child to be unburdened, and you want to have some of your, internal space back. Right? It's exhausting to try to hold up and attend to everybody's needs. But breaking down those patterns, identifying what are the boundaries that I need, how can I, the repetition of the growing pains you have to go through to then demonstrate those boundaries is a whole other thing. And so you really do need, and I so connect with these families that you're talking about, that you work with too, because neurodiversity rarely starts with the kid who is right. So
and also correct.
Yes.
By the way,
so I think a lot of times the kind of that second arm of parents who come to see me is oh, well, so I've been learning about what my child needs, and and coming to accept this diagnosis from my child. And it's also kind of opening up this whole new chapter of how I'm viewing how I went through school, how, whether I may have had a learning disability that wasn't diagnosed, or, there are just so many pieces there that have lasting impact. And now you're aware, and now you can attend to it. And I just want to encourage any parents who are listening to us that when you're putting services and supports in place for your child, it is equally, if not more important, I would argue, to also, seek support for yourself, because this is, the whole family really needs support. And if anybody needs a therapist or some recommended reading, other resources, please feel free to reach out to me. And I don't have to work with you. I can help you find someone else, or maybe I can work with you. But it's like it does open up the whole piece. And sometimes you can work on the relationship, like if you're aware, as you're like kind of looking at your family now with like new lenses, with the the neurodiversity frame and other pieces that might be informing sensory processing, whatever it is. That you may kind of come to the understanding that like, oh, okay, I'm seeing some real differences in my partner who's not really willing to like plug in and participate. But guess what? We can do relationship work even if that person is not ready to join in actively in the conversation. I mean, it is very possible to work on that in a meaningful way. So don't let your partner's unwillingness or not being ready keep you from reaching out, because you can still make meaningful shifts.
That's
possible.
So
I've seen it.
So good. If people want to find out more about you, where do they go?
happyparentshappybabies.com. I have a whole list of classes, including one coming up in June on siblings, which I'm super excited to talk about. So, I'd love to have anybody that you're connected with, and anyone. It's open to parents everywhere.
Fantastic. Emily Griffin, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle.
We'll have you back again soon, because we've got lots more to talk about.
Absolutely.